The study door slammed open with enough force to crack the oak paneling against the wall. Verity Crane stood frozen beside the antique desk, a faded photograph clutched in her trembling fingers. Behind her, Thaddeus Whitmore filled the doorway like a storm given human form. His chest heaved. His eyes, usually so controlled, blazed with something between fury and betrayal. "Tell me it's not true." His voice was quiet. That made it worse. "Tell me my daughter is lying. Tell me you didn't infiltrate my home, my family, with some hidden agenda I'm only now learning about." Verity's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. 3 months. Thaddeus stepped into the room, each footfall deliberate. 3 months you've lived under my roof. Cared for my children. Sat at my table. And the entire time, you've been hiding this? He gestured at the photograph she still held. A young woman with dark curls and laughing eyes. His dead wife. And standing beside her in the image, a small girl with hollow cheeks and a dress 2 sizes too big. A girl who looked exactly like Verity Crane had looked at 8 years old. "I can explain," Verity whispered. "Then explain." Thaddeus stopped 3 feet from her. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the vein pulsing at his temple, feel the heat of his anger radiating outward. "Explain why everything I thought I knew about you is apparently a lie." Verity's hand shook so violently the photograph fluttered to the carpet between them. She looked at it lying there. Looked at the face of the woman who had shown her kindness once, 2 decades ago, in a moment that had shaped everything she became afterward. And she realized she had no explanation that would sound like anything other than manipulation. "I never meant to deceive you," she said. "I just wanted to be close to something good. Something that reminded me that kindness existed. I thought if I told you, you'd never have let me stay." "You're right." Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "I wouldn't have." The words landed like physical blows. Verity absorbed them without flinching, because she had spent her entire life absorbing blows. Because somewhere deep in her chest, a familiar voice whispered what it had always whispered. "You see? You are not fit for this. Not fit for family. Not fit for belonging. Not fit for love. I'll pack my things," she heard herself say. "I'll be gone within the hour." She moved toward the door, but Thaddeus's voice stopped her. "The children." Something cracked in his tone. "What am I supposed to tell them?" Verity turned back, and for one moment, her composure shattered. Tears she never allowed herself to shed spilled down her cheeks. "Tell them I'm sorry," she said. "Tell them I loved them. Tell them it wasn't their fault." She walked past him, and he let her go. But this story doesn't begin in that study. It doesn't begin with Verity's secret exposed or Thaddeus's trust destroyed or the sound of a woman's footsteps echoing down a marble hallway toward exile. This story begins 3 years earlier, in a cramped apartment that smelled like lavender and approaching death. And if you want to understand how Verity Crane became the woman standing in that study, we need to go back to the night her grandmother stopped breathing. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to subscribe to Billionaire Stories with Mr. Lawson. We bring you emotionally gripping tales of love, loss, and second chances every single week. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The apartment measured exactly 412 square feet. Verity knew because she had measured it once, as a teenager, trying to calculate whether she could fit a bookshelf against the wall beside the radiator. She couldn't. The radiator leaked, and any books placed nearby would warp from the moisture. She learned to keep her library small. To want less. To need less. To take up as little space as possible in a world that had never seemed to want her in the first place. Her grandmother, Opal Crane, had taken her in at 7 years old. Not because she wanted to. Not because she had extra room or extra money or extra energy at 63 years old. But because Verity's mother had overdosed in a gas station bathroom, and there was no one else. There was never anyone else. Opal was not a warm woman. She didn't believe in coddling or comfort or conversations about feelings. She believed in work. In duty. In showing up even when you didn't want to. In keeping your head down and your expectations lower. But she had kept Verity. Fed her. Clothed her. Made sure she attended school and did her homework and stayed out of trouble. And in her own gruff, unsentimental way, she had loved her. Verity understood this only in retrospect. Only after the cancer diagnosis. Only after the treatments that drained their savings and then their dignity. Only after the hospital bills started arriving, each one larger than the last, each one pushing them closer to an edge they couldn't see but could certainly feel. The night Opal died, the apartment was silent except for the hiss of the oxygen tank they could no longer afford and the distant wail of sirens on the street below. Verity sat beside the bed, holding her grandmother's hand. The skin felt like paper. Like something already beginning to disappear. "You were always too soft," Opal said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I tried to toughen you up. Make you ready for a world that wouldn't be kind to you. Did I succeed?" "Yes, Grandma." "Liar." Opal's lips twitched. Almost a smile. "You're still soft. Still hoping. Still believing that if you just love hard enough, someone might love you back. Is that wrong? It's dangerous." Opal's fingers tightened around hers. "People like us, Verity. We aren't made for love. We're made for surviving. For getting through. For enduring what needs enduring and moving on to the next thing. Love is for people who can afford to be broken. We can't afford it." Verity didn't argue. She never argued with her grandmother. But somewhere in her chest, a small flame of defiance flickered. Maybe Opal was wrong. Maybe love wasn't just for people who could afford it. Maybe it was for everyone willing to risk the breaking. Or maybe her grandmother was right, and Verity was simply too foolish to accept it. Opal died at 3:47 in the morning. The hospice nurse came and made the necessary calls. Verity sat in the kitchen, drinking tea that had gone cold hours ago, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of a country she would never visit. The landlord arrived at 9. Not to offer condolences. To inform her that the apartment lease had been in Opal's name, that Verity had 30 days to vacate, and that any attempt to contest this would result in legal action. She was 27 years old. She had a high school diploma, a handful of community college credits, and 6 years of experience caring for a dying woman. She had no references, no savings, and no one to call. She had exactly what she'd always had. Herself. The funeral was small. A handful of neighbors attended out of obligation. No one from Opal's past. She had outlived everyone who might have mourned her. Verity stood at the graveside alone, listening to a minister she didn't know recite words that meant nothing. Afterward, she walked back to the apartment in the rain. She didn't have an umbrella. She didn't care. She stood in the center of the living room, water dripping from her hair onto the carpet that had needed replacing for a decade, and she spoke aloud for the first time since her grandmother's death. "I am not fit for love." The words felt true. They felt like armor. They felt like something she could wrap around herself for protection against a world that had never given her any softness. She said them again, testing them on her tongue. "I am not fit for love." Yes. That was better. That was safer. That was the truth her grandmother had tried to teach her for 20 years. Love was for other people. People with families and safety nets and photographs on mantles. People who could afford to be broken because someone would be there to help them pick up the pieces. Verity Crane was not one of those people. She never had been. She never would be. She began packing the apartment the same night. The next 6 months blurred together in a haze of temporary jobs and temporary rooms and temporary everything. Verity worked as a house cleaner, a grocery store stocker, a night shift attendant at a 24-hour laundromat where she learned to sleep with her eyes half open because you never knew who might walk in at 3 a.m. She ate ramen noodles and day-old bread from the discount bin. She owned 3 changes of clothes and washed them in the laundromat sink after her shifts. She kept her head down and her expectations lower, just like Opal had taught her. But even in the grayness of survival mode, there were moments of brightness. A regular customer at the grocery store who always asked about her day and seemed to actually listen to the answer. A child at the laundromat who drew her a picture of a rainbow and handed it over solemnly, as if bestowing a great gift. A sunrise glimpsed through a smeared window, all pink and gold and somehow suggesting that beauty still existed somewhere in the world. Verity collected these moments like precious stones. She told no one about them. They were hers alone. The call from the caregiver agency came on a Thursday afternoon in March. Verity was between jobs again. She had been for 2 weeks. The apartment she was subletting belonged to a friend of someone she'd met at a temp agency, and the rent was due in 4 days. She had exactly $47 in her bank account. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Miss Crane?" The voice was breathless, harried. "This is Daphne Merland from Merland Caregiving Services. We met briefly at the job fair last month. You filled out an application." Verity remembered. A fluorescent-lit convention center. A table covered in pamphlets promising meaningful work and competitive pay. A woman with gray-streaked hair and reading glasses who had seemed kind but overworked. "I remember," Verity said. "I have an emergency placement. A client is willing to pay triple our standard rate for someone who can start immediately. Full-time, live-in position. 3 children in need of care. The previous caregiver left without notice 2 days ago. Triple the standard rate. Live-in, meaning no rent. 3 children. What's the catch?" Verity asked, because there was always a catch. Daphne hesitated. The family has been through significant trauma. The mother passed away 8 months ago. Cancer. The father is struggling. The children have behavioral challenges related to their grief. We've placed 4 caregivers with them since the mother's death. None lasted more than 3 weeks. Why? The oldest child is difficult. Testing. Angry. She's driven away every caregiver we've sent. And the father is largely absent, emotionally and physically. He buries himself in work. The household runs on hired staff and willpower. Verity thought about the $47 in her bank account. She thought about the rent due in 4 days. She thought about the way her grandmother had taught her to survive, head down, expectations low, keep moving. "I'll take it," she said. "Don't you want to know more details?" The location, the specific requirements, the "I'll take it," Verity repeated. "When do I start?" Daphne exhaled in relief. "Tomorrow morning. I'll send you the address and the contract. The estate is about 2 hours north of the city. A car will be sent for you." Estate. A car will be sent. This was not the world Verity Crane came from. But she had learned long ago that survival meant going wherever survival required. Even if it meant stepping into a world that would never truly belong to her. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be ready." She hung up and stared at her phone for a long moment. Then she began packing. Again. The car arrived at precisely 8 a.m. A sleek black vehicle with tinted windows and a driver who introduced himself as Jeffrey and didn't speak another word for the entire 2-hour journey. Verity watched the city give way to suburbs, suburbs give way to countryside, countryside give way to something that looked like a painting. Rolling green hills. Ancient trees. Stone walls that had probably stood for centuries. And then, rising from the landscape like something out of a Gothic novel, Thornfield House. The estate was enormous. Grey stone walls covered in ivy that had been allowed to grow wild. Windows that reflected the pale morning light like watchful eyes. A circular driveway with a fountain in the center, currently still and empty. Jeffrey stopped the car at the front entrance and came around to open her door. "Mrs. Pemberton will meet you inside," he said. His first words in 2 hours. "Good luck, miss." The way he said it made Verity's stomach tighten. Like luck was something she would desperately need. She climbed the stone steps to the massive front door. Before she could knock, it swung open. The woman standing in the doorway was perhaps 60, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the house. She wore a black dress that might have been fashionable in 1950, and she held herself with the rigid posture of someone who had never slouched in her entire life. "Miss Crane." It wasn't a question. "I am Mrs. Pemberton. I manage the household. Follow me." No greeting. No warmth. No pretense of welcome. Verity followed. The interior of Thornfield House was as imposing as its exterior. High ceilings. Dark wood paneling. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls. Every surface gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that spoke of an army of housekeepers working invisibly to maintain perfection. Mrs. Pemberton walked quickly, and Verity had to hurry to keep pace. "The children's quarters are in the east wing. You will have a room adjacent to theirs. Meals are served in the small dining room at 7, noon, and 6. If you require anything outside of mealtimes, speak to the kitchen staff. Mr. Whitmore works from his study and is not to be disturbed unless there is an emergency. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." The previous caregivers made the mistake of trying to ingratiate themselves with Mr. Whitmore. Seeking his attention. Attempting to insert themselves into matters beyond their station. Mrs. Pemberton stopped walking and turned to face Verity. "You are here for the children. Only the children. Whatever else you might imagine happening in a house like this, I suggest you abandon those imaginings immediately." Verity met her gaze steadily. "I'm not here to ingratiate myself with anyone. I'm here to do a job." Mrs. Pemberton studied her for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, though Verity couldn't identify what. "We shall see," she said finally. "This way." The children's wing was brighter than the rest of the house. Someone had made an effort here. Yellow curtains in the hallway. A carpet with a pattern of flowers. Artwork that actually showed children at play rather than stern ancestors. "Miss Cressida is in the library," Mrs. Pemberton said. "Master Bram is in his room. Miss Rosalind is in the nursery. I suggest you begin with Cressida. She is the most difficult, and it's best to face difficult things first." She gestured toward a door at the end of the hall, then turned and walked away without another word. Verity stood alone in the children's corridor, listening to the silence of the house settle around her. Somewhere, a clock ticked. Somewhere else, pipes groaned. She thought about the photograph she had seen in the car. Daphne had included it in the information packet. A family portrait taken perhaps 2 years ago. A beautiful woman with dark curls and laughing eyes seated in the center. 3 children arranged around her. A man standing slightly apart, his hand on his wife's shoulder, his expression suggesting he couldn't quite believe his luck. They had been happy once. This family. This house. And then death had come, and happiness had left, and what remained was grief wearing the costume of daily life. Verity understood this. She understood it in her bones. She walked to the library door and knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Go away. The voice was young, female, and sharp enough to cut glass. I don't want another nanny. I don't want another governess. I don't want another caregiver or companion or whatever euphemism they're using this week. Go away and tell them I said no. Verity opened the door anyway. The library was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A fireplace that looked like it hadn't been lit in months. 2 leather armchairs positioned before tall windows that overlooked what might once have been a garden. In one of those armchairs sat a girl of perhaps 13. Dark hair, like her mother. Sharp features that would be beautiful someday but were currently arranged in an expression of pure hostility. She wore a school uniform even though it was clearly a holiday, and she held a book in her hands like a weapon. I said go away. I heard you. Verity stepped into the room. I'm Verity Crane. I'm the new caregiver. I know who you are. I don't care. You won't last. None of them do. You're Cressida. Obviously. Verity walked to the window and looked out at the garden. It was overgrown, wild, forgotten. Like grief made botanical. The last caregiver lasted 16 days, Cressida said. The one before that made it 11. There's a betting pool among the staff. Jeffrey has his money on you being gone by Wednesday. What day is it today? Saturday. Then Jeffrey is an optimist. Something flickered in Cressida's expression. Not quite amusement, but close. You're not what I expected, she admitted. What did you expect? Someone who would try to be my friend. Someone who would tell me they understood what I was going through. Someone who would promise everything would get better if I just opened up and shared my feelings. Cressida's voice dripped contempt. That's what they all say. It's nauseating. Verity turned from the window. I'm not going to tell you I understand what you're going through. I didn't know your mother. I don't know your grief. And I'm definitely not going to promise that everything will get better, because I have no idea if it will. Cressida blinked. Then what are you going to do? My job. Which is making sure you and your siblings are fed, clothed, educated, and reasonably safe. Beyond that, I have no agenda. You don't want me to like you? Want has nothing to do with it. You'll either like me or you won't. That's your choice, not mine. Cressida studied her with narrowed eyes. Verity could practically see the wheels turning in her head, calculating, assessing, trying to find the angle. You're strange, Cressida said finally. I've been told. I'm going to test you. Just so you know. I'm going to make your life miserable. I'm going to break rules and say cruel things and do everything in my power to drive you away. I appreciate the warning. It's not a warning. It's a promise. Verity nodded slowly. Then I'll make you a promise in return. No matter what you do, I'm not going to yell at you. I'm not going to punish you in ways that demean you. And I'm not going to leave until you actually need me to go. What does that mean? It means I'll leave when staying would hurt you more than leaving. Not before. Cressida's composure cracked, just slightly. Something raw and young and frightened flickered behind her eyes before she buried it again. We'll see, she said, echoing Mrs. Pemberton's earlier words. Yes, Verity agreed. We will. She left the library and walked down the hall to find the next child. Now, before we continue with Verity meeting Bram and Rosalind, I want to take a moment. If this story is pulling you in, if you're feeling the weight of this house and these broken people trying to find their way back to each other, let me know. Drop a comment telling me what you think Cressida is really feeling beneath all that hostility. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Billionaire Stories with Mr. Lawson so you can see how this story unfolds. Let's continue. Bram's door was covered in drawings. Dozens of them, taped and layered and overlapping until the wood beneath was barely visible. Verity paused to look at them. Trees. Houses. A dog that might have been a horse. A woman with dark curly hair, appearing again and again, smiling, waving, surrounded by hearts. His mother. Over and over. His mother. Verity knocked gently. Come in. The voice was small, eager, nothing like Cressida's sharp rejection. She opened the door. The room was chaos made comfortable. Books scattered across every surface. A half-finished puzzle on the floor. Stuffed animals arranged in complex formations that suggested elaborate imaginary scenarios. And in the center of it all, a boy of about 10 with sandy hair and anxious eyes, already rising from his desk with a smile that seemed too bright. Hello. You must be the new caregiver. I'm Bram. Short for Bramwell, which is a family name, but nobody calls me that except Mrs. Pemberton when she's annoyed with me, which is often because I make messes, but I'm working on being tidier, I really am. He spoke in a rush, words tumbling over each other, hands fidgeting at his sides. I'm Verity. She stepped into the room carefully, avoiding a stack of books. It's nice to meet you, Bram. I'm very glad you're here. We need someone. The house gets so quiet without someone new, and Cressida's been terrible, just terrible, but she doesn't mean it, she's just sad, we're all sad, but she shows it by being mean and I show it by. He stopped abruptly. Sorry. I talk too much when I'm nervous. Mum used to say I had verbal overflow. She thought it was funny. Do you think it's funny? I think it's honest, Verity said. There's nothing wrong with honest. Bram's smile flickered, uncertain. The last lady said I needed to learn self-control. She said I was overwhelming. Were you overwhelming to her? I don't know. Maybe. She didn't like when I asked questions. I ask a lot of questions. Is that going to be a problem? Verity looked around the room, at all the evidence of a child trying desperately to keep himself occupied, to fill the silence, to drown out whatever thoughts came when things got too quiet. You can ask me as many questions as you want, she said. I might not always have answers, but I'll always listen. Bram's eyes went bright with something that might have been tears. He blinked rapidly. That's what Mum used to say. His voice cracked. She said questions were how we learned about the world and she'd rather I asked too many than not enough. She sounds like she was wise. She was the wisest. Bram looked down at his fidgeting hands. I miss her every day. I know I'm supposed to be getting better. That's what the grief counselor says. That time helps. But it doesn't feel like time is helping. It feels like time is just making her farther away. Verity crossed the room slowly, giving him space to retreat if he needed it. When she reached him, she knelt down so they were at eye level. Can I tell you something, Bram? He nodded. Grief doesn't work on a schedule. There's no right way to feel it and no right amount of time to feel it for. Anyone who tells you that you should be getting better by now doesn't understand what loss actually means. What does it actually mean? Verity considered the question carefully. It means that a person who was part of your world isn't there anymore. And your world has to rebuild itself around that absence. Sometimes the rebuilding takes months. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes there are parts that never fully rebuild at all. And that's okay. That's just what love costs. Bram was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. I think I'm going to like you, he said softly. I think I'm going to like you too. She stayed with him for another 20 minutes, asking about his puzzle and his drawings and the elaborate storylines he had created for his stuffed animals. He talked and talked and talked, and she listened. By the time she left his room, some of the anxiety had faded from his eyes. One more child to meet. The nursery was at the far end of the corridor, through a door painted pale pink with a small gold nameplate that read Rosalind. Verity hesitated with her hand on the doorknob. She had read the file Daphne sent. She knew about Rosalind. 6 years old. Mute since her mother's death. Communicates through drawings, the file had said. Refuses physical touch from most people. Highly sensitive to loud noises and sudden movements. She opened the door quietly. The nursery was soft. Pastel walls. A canopy bed draped in white fabric. A window seat piled with cushions. And toys everywhere, though they seemed largely untouched, as if arranged by someone else and never played with. In the corner, at a small table, sat a girl so small she seemed to disappear into herself. Rosalind had her mother's dark curls. Her eyes were large and serious, fixed on the paper in front of her, her small hand moving a crayon back and forth in careful strokes. She didn't look up when Verity entered. Didn't acknowledge her presence at all. Verity stood still, not approaching. Not speaking. Just waiting. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Then 3. Rosalind's crayon paused. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening. Still, Verity waited. Finally, Rosalind turned. Her eyes met Verity's. They were old, those eyes. Far too old for a 6-year-old. They held a question and a challenge and a deep, profound exhaustion. Verity understood. She had seen those eyes before. In the mirror, when she was 7, sitting in a social worker's office with a garbage bag of belongings, learning that no one was coming for her. She didn't smile. Didn't speak. Didn't move closer. She simply nodded. Rosalind nodded back. Then she returned to her drawing. Verity stayed in the doorway for another few minutes, watching the small hand move across the paper. Eventually, she stepped back into the hallway and closed the door gently behind her. It wasn't much. A nod. A moment of recognition. But it was a start. The first week passed in small moments of connection and larger stretches of endurance. Cressida made good on her promise to test Verity at every turn. She refused to eat meals at the table, instead taking plates to her room and leaving them outside her door, food untouched, as if daring someone to comment. She broke curfew repeatedly, wandering the grounds at midnight until Verity would find her and walk her back in silence. She made cutting remarks about Verity's clothes, her background, her lack of education and refinement. Verity absorbed it all without reacting. She didn't argue. She didn't punish. She simply showed up, day after day, steady as a heartbeat. Bram was easier, in some ways harder in others. He attached himself to Verity almost immediately, following her through the house, asking endless questions, sharing every thought that crossed his mind. His need for connection was enormous, and Verity found herself exhausted by the end of each day. But she also found herself grateful. At least Bram reached out. At least he was still trying. Rosalind remained a mystery. She attended meals but didn't eat much. She sat in the nursery drawing for hours. She watched Verity from doorways with those ancient eyes, evaluating, considering. On the 6th day, Verity found a drawing slipped under her bedroom door. It showed 4 figures. 3 children, recognizable by their sizes and hair colors. And a 4th figure, taller, standing slightly apart but connected to the others by a single red line. Verity stared at the drawing for a long time. Then she placed it carefully in her drawer, with the rainbow picture and the other small treasures she had collected over the years. She was being included. Tentatively. Cautiously. But included. And Thaddeus Whitmore? He remained a ghost. Verity saw glimpses of him in the halls. A tall figure disappearing around corners. A closed study door. A car pulling away from the house at odd hours. The staff spoke of him in hushed tones, with a mixture of pity and frustration. He wasn't like this before, Mrs. Pemberton said once, catching Verity watching his car depart at 6 a.m. Before Mrs. Whitmore's illness. He was present. Engaged. The children adored him. She paused. Now he can barely look at them. They remind him too much of what he's lost. That must be difficult for them, Verity said carefully. It's destroying them. Mrs. Pemberton's voice was sharp with something that might have been anger. A child can survive losing one parent if the other one shows up. But losing both? One to death and one to grief? That's a wound that never heals properly. She walked away before Verity could respond. But the words stayed with her. Echoed in her head as she lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, listening to the massive house settle around her. She thought about Cressida's hostility, which looked more and more like abandoned hope. About Bram's desperation for connection. About Rosalind's silence, which wasn't emptiness but protection. And she thought about Thaddeus Whitmore, hiding in his study, unable to reach his children because reaching them meant acknowledging that his wife was gone. She understood that too. More than she wanted to admit. Because sometimes love hurt too much. Sometimes the risk of losing again was worse than the loneliness of never connecting at all. Sometimes closing yourself off wasn't selfishness but survival. I am not fit for love. The mantra rose up automatically, familiar as breathing. But lying there in the darkness of Thornfield House, surrounded by people who were drowning in grief they couldn't share, the words felt different. Less like truth. More like surrender. The midnight kitchen encounter happened at the end of the second week. Verity couldn't sleep. This wasn't unusual. She often couldn't sleep. But tonight the insomnia was particularly insistent, and she found herself wandering the darkened hallways of Thornfield House, learning its geography by moonlight. The kitchen was in the back of the house, through a series of corridors that staff used during the day. At night, it was silent, empty, the massive stoves and copper pots gleaming in the darkness like sleeping giants. Or so she thought. She pushed open the swinging door and froze. Thaddeus Whitmore sat at the long wooden table in the center of the room. A glass of whiskey in front of him, untouched. His hands flat on the table, palms down, as if holding himself steady. He looked up when she entered. His eyes were red-rimmed. Exhausted. Surprised to see another person in his 3 a.m. solitude. I'm sorry. Verity stepped back. I didn't know anyone was here. I'll go. No. The word came quickly. Stay. If you'd like. I don't actually enjoy sitting in the dark alone. I've just gotten used to it. Verity hesitated. Mrs. Pemberton's warnings echoed in her mind. You are here for the children. Only the children. But Thaddeus looked so tired. So alone. So exactly like she felt most nights. She moved to the counter and began making tea. The familiar motions were soothing. Fill the kettle. Find the tea bags. Locate cups. Neither of them spoke while the water heated. When her tea was ready, she sat across from him at the long table. Close enough to talk. Far enough to respect whatever boundaries remained between them. You've been here 2 weeks, Thaddeus said finally. That's longer than most. Yes. The children. How are they? Verity considered the question. Considered how honest to be. They're struggling, she said. But they're still fighting. That counts for something. Fighting against what? Against the grief that wants to swallow them whole. Against the fear that they'll lose more than they've already lost. Against the silence in a house that used to be full of laughter. She paused. Against the feeling that no one is coming for them. Thaddeus flinched. The words had landed exactly where she intended. You think I've abandoned them? I think you're trying to survive. I think survival sometimes looks like abandonment, even when it's not meant to. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. My wife, Celeste. She was the one who knew how to reach them. How to talk to them, play with them, understand what they needed. I provided. I protected. But the connection, the actual parenting, that was her gift. He looked down at his untouched whiskey. Without her, I don't know how to be what they need. Maybe you don't need to know right now. Maybe you just need to show up. Show up. Be present. Even when you don't know what to say. Even when everything feels wrong. Just be in the same room as them. Eat meals at the same table. Watch the same sunset. Showing up isn't about having answers. It's about proving that they're worth being around. Thaddeus looked at her with something shifting in his expression. Recognition, perhaps. Or curiosity. You speak like someone who understands absence. I do. Will you tell me about it? Verity looked into her tea. The question was too personal. The answer would reveal too much. Every instinct she had developed over 30 years of self-protection screamed at her to deflect, to change the subject, to keep her walls intact. But something about the darkness, the quietness, the shared loneliness of this 3 a.m. kitchen made her answer differently. Another time, she said. If you're still curious. I will be. He didn't push. That surprised her. Most people pushed. They sat in silence for another few minutes. Then Verity finished her tea and stood. I should try to sleep again. Miss Crane. Thaddeus's voice stopped her at the door. Thank you. For staying. For what you said. For not looking at me with pity. I don't pity you, Mr. Whitmore. I understand you. There's a difference. She left him sitting in the darkness. But something had shifted between them, imperceptibly, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface. Neither of them knew it yet, but that midnight conversation was the beginning of everything that came after. The beginning of healing. The beginning of discovery. The beginning of a truth that would eventually shatter everything Verity had tried to keep hidden. And if you want to know what truth Verity was hiding, what connection she had to this family that she had never revealed, and how everything fell apart before it could come back together, stay with me. The weeks that followed the midnight kitchen conversation changed the texture of life at Thornfield House. It started small. Thaddeus appearing at breakfast on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the head of the table where his place had gathered dust for months. The children froze when they saw him. Bram's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Cressida's expression flickered between hope and suspicion. Rosalind simply stared, her dark eyes unreadable. Good morning, Thaddeus said. His voice was uncertain, rusty from disuse in this context. I thought I might join you today. No one responded. The silence stretched like a held breath. Verity set down the teapot she had been carrying. There's fresh toast. And Mrs. Pemberton made that marmalade you like, Bram. The mundane observation broke the spell. Bram reached for the marmalade with trembling hands. Cressida returned her attention to her plate, though she kept stealing glances at her father. Rosalind continued to stare. Thaddeus sat down. He didn't know where to put his hands. He didn't know what to say. The awkwardness radiated from him like heat from a fever. But he was there. He had shown up. Verity caught his eye across the table and nodded, just slightly. He nodded back. It was a start. The breakfast appearances continued. Sporadic at first, then more regular. Thaddeus would sit and listen while Bram chattered about his latest interests. He would endure Cressida's pointed silences without retreating. He would watch Rosalind draw on napkins, her small hand moving in patterns only she understood. He didn't know how to reach them. That much was obvious. But he was trying. And the children, despite their wariness, were responding. Cressida's hostility toward Verity began to soften. Not disappear, but transform into something more complicated. She still tested boundaries, still made cutting remarks, but there was less venom behind them. More performance than genuine attack. One afternoon, Verity found her in the library, staring out the window at the overgrown garden. "My mother planted that garden," Cressida said without turning around. "Every flower, every shrub. She spent hours out there. Said it was her therapy." Verity stood in the doorway, not approaching. "It must have been beautiful." "It was." Cressida's voice cracked slightly. "After she got sick, no one maintained it. Dad couldn't bear to look at it. The gardener tried, but it wasn't the same. Now it's just a mess. Gardens can be restored." "Can they?" Cressida turned, and for the first time, Verity saw the child beneath the armor. 13 years old. Terrified. Grieving in ways she didn't know how to express. Can anything be restored once it's been destroyed? Verity thought about her own life. The destruction she had survived. The pieces she had never managed to put back together. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think it's worth trying." Cressida was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that caught Verity completely off guard. "Will you help me? With the garden? I want to fix it. For Mum." "Yes," Verity said without hesitation. "I'll help you." They started the next morning. 2 hours before breakfast, while the dew still clung to the wild grass and the sun was just beginning to warm the air. Verity didn't know much about gardening, but she knew how to work. How to pull weeds and clear debris and follow instructions. Cressida, it turned out, had inherited her mother's knowledge. She knew which plants were worth saving and which had grown beyond repair. She knew how to prune and transplant and coax life from soil that seemed exhausted. They worked in silence mostly. But it was a different kind of silence than before. Companionable. Shared. One morning, halfway through their third week of garden restoration, Cressida spoke without looking up from the rosebush she was trimming. "I'm sorry." Verity paused, trowel in hand. "For what?" "For being horrible to you when you first arrived. For trying to drive you away. For all the things I said. You were protecting yourself. I understood that." Cressida shook her head. "No. I was punishing you for not being her. Every caregiver they sent, I looked at them and saw someone trying to take my mother's place. It made me so angry. But you never tried to replace her. You just tried to be there." Verity set down her trowel and moved closer to the girl. "Not touching. Just present. Your mother isn't replaceable, Cressida. No one who loves you would ever try to replace her. We're just trying to help you carry the weight of missing her." Cressida's shoulders began to shake. The tears came slowly at first, then faster, until she was sobbing in the middle of her mother's garden, surrounded by the roses Celeste Whitmore had planted years ago. Verity didn't speak. Didn't offer platitudes. She simply sat beside Cressida in the dirt and let her cry. When the tears finally subsided, Cressida wiped her face with muddy hands, leaving streaks across her cheeks. "You're not like the others," she said quietly. "I know. Why do you stay? Really? It's not just the money. I can tell." Verity felt the question land in a place she had been avoiding. The truth pressed against her chest, demanding release. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. Because you need someone to, she said. It was true, if incomplete. Cressida seemed to accept this. She picked up her pruning shears and returned to work. But the question lingered in the air between them, unanswered. Bram's transformation was more gradual but equally profound. The anxiety that had driven his constant talking began to ease as the household stabilized. He still asked endless questions, still sought connection with the desperation of a child who had learned that people could disappear without warning. But there was less panic beneath it now. Less fear. He started sleeping through the night. This was significant. According to Mrs. Pemberton, he had suffered nightmares nearly every night since his mother's death, often ending up in Cressida's room, unable to bear his own. I dreamed about Mum last night, he told Verity one morning at breakfast. But it wasn't a sad dream. She was in the garden, the way it used to be. She was laughing. Thaddeus looked up from his newspaper. Something passed across his face that Verity couldn't quite name. What was she laughing about? He asked. His voice was rough, but he was asking. He was engaging. Bram's face lit up at the attention. I don't know. Something Cressida said, I think. Cressida was there too, and Rosalind, and me. We were all there together. It felt nice. That sounds like a good dream, Thaddeus said. It was. Bram hesitated, then added, You were there too, Dad. At the end. You came into the garden and Mum waved at you. Thaddeus set down his newspaper. His eyes were bright, but he didn't look away from his son. I'm glad I was there, he said quietly. I wish I was there more. Hear more. I'm trying to be. I know, Dad. Bram's voice was small but steady. I can tell. Verity busied herself with the teapot, giving them a moment of privacy. But she felt the shift in the room, the tentative reaching toward each other that was beginning to bridge the distance grief had created. Rosalind remained the most difficult to read. She still didn't speak. The doctors had examined her multiple times, confirmed there was nothing physically wrong. The mutism was psychological, they said. Trauma-induced. She would speak again when she was ready, if she ever was. But Verity noticed things. The way Rosalind's drawings had changed since her arrival. At first, they had been dark, abstract, full of sharp angles and empty spaces. Now they included more color. More figures. More connection. The drawing she had slipped under Verity's door that first week was followed by others. A house with smoke rising from the chimney. A garden full of flowers. A table with 5 chairs, each one occupied. The red line connecting the figures in that first drawing appeared in every image. Sometimes bold, sometimes faint, but always present. One afternoon, Verity sat in the nursery while Rosalind drew. She had learned that proximity without pressure was the key to connecting with this child. Just being there. Just bearing witness. Rosalind finished her drawing and looked at it for a long moment. Then she stood, crossed the room, and placed it in Verity's hands. It showed 2 figures. One tall, one small. The tall figure had brown hair and wore a blue dress, like the one Verity had worn yesterday. The small figure had dark curls and held the tall figure's hand. Beneath the figures, in careful, shaky letters, was a single word. Stay. Verity's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. She looked at Rosalind, who was watching her with those ancient, serious eyes. I'm not going anywhere, Verity said softly. I promise. Rosalind nodded once. Then she returned to her table and began a new drawing. It wasn't speech. But it was communication. It was trust. And it was more than Verity had ever expected to receive. The photograph changed everything. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks into Verity's time at Thornfield House. She was helping Mrs. Pemberton sort through storage boxes in the attic, part of an ongoing effort to organize the household that had fallen into disarray during Celeste's illness and death. Most of the boxes contained exactly what you would expect. Old linens. Outdated kitchen equipment. Tax records from decades past. But one box, tucked into a corner and covered with a thick layer of dust, was different. "What's this?" Verity asked, pulling it toward her. Mrs. Pemberton glanced over. "I'm not certain. It's been there for years. Probably more of Mrs. Whitmore's things. She was always collecting odds and ends." Verity opened the box. Inside were stacks of photographs, old letters, and what appeared to be journals dating back decades. "These are from before she was married," Verity said, examining the dates on the letters. "From her childhood. Mrs. Whitmore came from an old family. The Harringtons. Old money, though most of it was gone by the time she was born. She grew up in a grand house with more history than funds." Mrs. Pemberton's voice softened with memory. "She used to joke that she married Mr. Whitmore for his money, but anyone could see they were mad about each other." Verity continued sorting through the photographs. Celeste as a child, gap-toothed and grinning. Celeste as a teenager, beautiful and serious. Celeste as a young woman, standing in front of what appeared to be a charity event. And then Verity's hands stopped moving. The photograph showed Celeste at perhaps 20 years old, kneeling beside a small girl with hollow cheeks and a dress 2 sizes too big. Behind them was a banner that read Harrington House Charity Gala. Celeste was smiling at the camera, but her hand rested on the small girl's shoulder with obvious affection. The small girl was Verity. She was 8 years old in that photograph. It had been taken at a charity event her grandmother had cleaned at, one of the rare occasions when Verity had been allowed to accompany her to work. She had been sitting alone in a corner, invisible, forgotten, when a beautiful young woman had approached her. "You look lonely," the woman had said. Her voice was kind, not pitying. "I'm Celeste." "What's your name?" "Verity." "That's a beautiful name. It means truth, did you know that?" Verity hadn't known. She had always assumed her mother had chosen it randomly, if she had chosen it at all. "Would you like to come see the garden? It's my favorite place in this whole house. My mother planted it when I was your age." Celeste had taken her hand and led her through a side door into a garden that seemed to exist in a different world. Flowers everywhere, colors Verity had never seen outside of picture books. A fountain with a stone angel in the center. Paths made of crushed shells that crunched beneath their feet. "My mother always said that gardens are where magic lives," Celeste told her. "Not fairy tale magic. Real magic. The magic of things growing even when everything seems impossible." They had spent an hour together. Celeste had shown her every flower, naming them, explaining their stories. She had picked a white rose and tucked it behind Verity's ear. She had asked questions about Verity's life with genuine interest, not the forced curiosity adults usually showed. When it was time to leave, Celeste had knelt down and taken both of Verity's hands in hers. "I want you to remember something," she said. "No matter what anyone tells you, no matter how hard things get, you are worthy of kindness. You are worthy of love. Don't ever let the world convince you otherwise." Someone had snapped a photograph at that moment. Verity hadn't even noticed. And now, 22 years later, she held that photograph in her trembling hands. "Miss Crane?" Mrs. Pemberton's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right? You've gone quite pale." Verity couldn't speak. Couldn't explain. She simply stared at the image of herself as a child, standing beside the woman whose children she now cared for, whose husband she found herself increasingly drawn to, whose absence haunted every room of this house. She had taken this job because she needed money. She had told herself that. It was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. When she saw the address of the placement, she had recognized it. Thornfield House. The Whitmore estate. The home of Celeste Harrington Whitmore. She had known. Some part of her had known. And she had come anyway, seeking something she couldn't name. Connection, perhaps. To the woman who had shown her kindness when no one else bothered. To the memory of being told she was worthy of love, even if she had never been able to believe it. She hadn't planned to deceive anyone. She simply hadn't planned to explain. The connection seemed too strange, too coincidental, too likely to be misunderstood. But now, standing in this dusty attic with the evidence in her hands, she realized what she had done. She had built something real with this family. Something true. And she had built it on a foundation of omission that could collapse at any moment. "I need some air," she managed to say. "I'm sorry. I need to go." She fled the attic, the photograph still clutched in her hand, her heart pounding with the knowledge that she had made a terrible mistake. Before we continue with what happened next, I want to take a moment for those of you who have been following this story. If you're invested in Verity's journey, if you're wondering how Thaddeus will react when he learns the truth, drop a comment below. Tell me what you would do in her situation. Would you confess? Would you stay silent? And if you haven't already, subscribe to Billionaire Stories with Mr. Lawson. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. Now, let's continue. Verity didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the photograph on her nightstand, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. She could destroy the evidence. Burn the photograph, never speak of it, continue as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. She knew now, with sickening certainty, that her presence in this house was not coincidence. She had followed a thread that connected her past to this family's present, and she had done it without their knowledge or consent. It felt like betrayal. Even though she had never intended harm. Even though her motives had been unclear even to herself. She could confess. Tell Thaddeus everything. Explain about the charity gala and the garden and the words Celeste had spoken to her 22 years ago. Explain that she had come here seeking something she couldn't name, some connection to a moment of kindness that had sustained her through years of loneliness and struggle. But how would that sound? It would sound calculated. Manipulative. Like she had infiltrated his home under false pretenses, wormed her way into his children's trust, all because of some strange obsession with his dead wife. Neither option felt acceptable. Neither path led anywhere good. Morning came anyway. Verity dressed in a daze and went through the motions of her duties. Breakfast with the children. Garden work with Cressida. Questions from Bram. Silent companionship with Rosalind. She kept the photograph in her pocket. She couldn't have said why. It felt like carrying a bomb. The explosion came 3 days later. Cressida found it. Verity had been careless. She had left her cardigan on a chair in the library, the photograph in its pocket, while she helped Rosalind with an art project in the nursery. Cressida, looking for a book, had knocked the cardigan to the floor. The photograph had fallen out. And Cressida, curious by nature and sharp by temperament, had looked at it. Really looked at it. And recognized her mother. Verity was in the kitchen, discussing menus with the cook, when Cressida found her. The girl stood in the doorway, the photograph in her hand, her face pale with shock that was rapidly transforming into fury. "What is this?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried like a scream. Verity's heart stopped. "Cressida. I can explain." "Explain what?" "Why you have a photograph of my mother with some random child. Why you've been hiding it. Why you..." Cressida's eyes widened as understanding dawned. That's you. In the photograph. That child is you. The cook was staring. Other staff members had appeared in doorways, drawn by the commotion. Yes, Verity said. There was no point in lying. That's me. You knew my mother. Cressida's voice rose. Before any of this. Before you came here. You knew her and you didn't tell us. It wasn't like that. I met her once. Just once. When I was 8 years old. I never saw her again. Then why do you have this? Cressida waved the photograph. Why did you come here? Did you plan this? Did you seek us out? Have you been lying to us this entire time? No. I mean, not exactly. I trusted you. Cressida's voice cracked. I told you things I've never told anyone. I cried in front of you. I let you into the garden, my mother's garden, and the whole time you were hiding this. Cressida, please. Let me explain properly. But Cressida was already running. Down the hallway, toward the east wing, toward her father's study. Verity followed, but she already knew it was too late. The truth she had failed to tell was about to be delivered by someone else, in the worst possible way. She heard the study door crash open. Heard Cressida's voice, high and desperate, pouring out the story in fragments. Heard Thaddeus's responses, confused at first, then sharp with growing alarm. By the time Verity reached the doorway, Thaddeus was standing behind his desk, the photograph in his hand, his face a mask of controlled fury that was far more terrifying than outright rage. Tell me it's not true. His voice was quiet. That made it worse. Tell me my daughter is lying. Tell me you didn't infiltrate my home, my family, with some hidden agenda I'm only now learning about. Verity's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. 3 months. Thaddeus stepped toward her. 3 months you've lived under my roof. Cared for my children. Sat at my table. And the entire time, you've been hiding this? This was the moment from the beginning of this story. The moment of confrontation. The moment of truth that Verity had been dreading since the day she arrived. I can explain, she whispered. Then explain. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could see the vein pulsing at his temple. Explain why everything I thought I knew about you is apparently a lie. Verity's hand shook so violently the photograph would have fallen if she had been holding it. She watched it lying there on the desk between them, her past and his present colliding. I never meant to deceive you, she said. I just wanted to be close to something good. Something that reminded me that kindness existed. I thought if I told you, you'd never have let me stay. You're right. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. I wouldn't have. The words landed like physical blows. Verity absorbed them without flinching, because she had spent her entire life absorbing blows. I'll pack my things, she heard herself say. I'll be gone within the hour. She moved toward the door, but Thaddeus's voice stopped her. The children. Something cracked in his tone. What am I supposed to tell them? Verity turned back, and for one moment, her composure shattered. Tears she never allowed herself to shed spilled down her cheeks. Tell them I'm sorry, she said. Tell them I loved them. Tell them it wasn't their fault. Cressida stood in the corner of the study, her face stricken. The fury had drained away, replaced by something that looked like horror at what she had done. Verity, she started. I didn't mean. But Verity was already walking away. Down the hallway. Past Mrs. Pemberton's shocked face. Past Bram, who had appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression confused and frightened. Past Rosalind's nursery, where she could see the small figure standing at the window, watching. She packed in 10 minutes. Everything she owned fit in the same single suitcase she had arrived with. She had accumulated nothing in 3 months because some part of her had always known this moment would come. Jeffrey drove her to the train station in silence. He didn't offer words of comfort. He simply handed her a small envelope as she exited the car. "From Mrs. Pemberton," he said. "She wanted you to have it." Verity didn't open it until she was on the train, watching Thornfield House disappear into the distance. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address and a brief note. "This is where you can be reached. For when they come to their senses." Verity folded the note carefully and placed it in her pocket. Then she closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the train carry her away from everything she had dared to love. The apartment she returned to was exactly as she had left it. Small. Empty. Cold. The sublease had expired weeks ago, but the friend of a friend had extended it indefinitely, perhaps sensing that Verity might need a place to land. She stood in the center of the single room and looked at the water stain on the ceiling that had once seemed like a map to somewhere else. Now it just looked like damage. The first week passed in a blur of nothingness. Verity didn't eat much. Didn't sleep much. Didn't do much of anything except sit by the window and watch the world continue without her. She thought about Cressida. The garden they had planted together. The conversations about grief and recovery and the possibility of restoration. She thought about Bram. His endless questions. His desperate need for connection. The way he had finally started sleeping through the night. She thought about Rosalind. The drawings. The single word she had written. Stay. She had promised to stay. She had broken that promise. "I am not fit for love." The mantra returned like an old friend. Like the only comfort she had ever known. "You see? You tried. You reached out. You let yourself want something. And this is what happens. This is what always happens. You are not fit for this. Not fit for family. Not fit for belonging. Not fit for love." The words wrapped around her like a shroud. She let them. The second week was worse. Verity stopped leaving the apartment. Stopped answering her phone. Stopped caring about much of anything. The darkness that had always lurked at the edges of her consciousness began to creep inward, claiming territory she had defended for years. She was disappearing. She could feel it happening. The slow withdrawal from life that had almost taken her once before, in the months after Opal's death. On the 14th day, someone knocked on her door. She ignored it. She had been ignoring everything. The knock came again. More insistent. "Verity." A voice she didn't recognize. "Verity, please open the door. I have a message from Mrs. Pemberton." Mrs. Pemberton. The name cut through the fog. Verity dragged herself to the door and opened it. A young woman stood in the hallway. One of the housemaids from Thornfield, Verity realized. She looked nervous. "Mrs. Pemberton asked me to bring you this." She held out an envelope. She said it was urgent. Verity took the envelope with numb fingers. The maid hesitated, then spoke again. "Miss Crane. I don't know the whole situation. I don't know why you left. But the children, they're not doing well. None of them are. Especially Miss Rosalind. She's stopped drawing. She just sits at the window, watching the driveway. Like she's waiting for someone." The words pierced something in Verity's chest. Something she had tried to bury. "Thank you," she managed to say. "For telling me." The maid nodded and left. Verity closed the door and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from Mrs. Pemberton. Handwritten. Several pages long. "Miss Crane. I have served the Whitmore family for 32 years. I served Mrs. Celeste since she was a bride of 23. I knew her better than almost anyone, and I can tell you with certainty that she would be horrified by what has happened. I know about the photograph. I know about the charity gala. I also know things you may not have realized I knew. I know that Mrs. Celeste kept a journal, and in that journal, she wrote about a little girl she met at a gala when she was 20 years old. A little girl with hollow cheeks and sad eyes who reminded her why charity mattered. Who made her understand that kindness, even small kindnesses, could change lives. She wrote about you, Miss Crane. She remembered you for 20 years. When she was dying, she told me she regretted not finding you. Not knowing what became of the little girl who had seemed so alone in the world. She said she hoped you had found people who loved you. She said she wished she could have been one of them. You came to this house seeking connection to her memory. I understand that now. And I understand why you didn't explain it. It would have sounded calculated. It would have sounded strange. How could you tell a grieving widower that you had come to his home because his dead wife had once shown you kindness? But here is what I need you to understand. The connection you sought was real. Mrs. Celeste would have wanted you here. She would have wanted someone who understood loneliness to care for her children. She would have wanted her husband to know that the kindness she showed a child 20 years ago had returned to save her own children. Mr. Whitmore has made a mistake. He reacted from fear, from grief, from a place of protectiveness that has become so extreme it is harming the very people he is trying to protect. He sent you away because he was afraid of what your presence meant. Afraid of the possibility that he might have to trust someone again. But the children are suffering. Miss Cressida has not left her room in days. She blames herself for your departure. Master Bram has returned to his nightmares, worse than before. And Miss Rosalind has stopped communicating entirely. No drawings. No gestures. Nothing. You made a promise to that little girl. You told her you would stay. I am not asking you to return for Mr. Whitmore's sake. I am asking you to return for theirs. Whatever you decide, I want you to know this. You are not unworthy of love. You are not unfit for family. You are a woman who survived impossible circumstances and still found enough softness in herself to care for 3 broken children. That is not weakness. That is the greatest strength I have ever witnessed. Please consider coming back. Please consider giving them a chance to make this right. With respect and hope. Margaret Pemberton. Verity read the letter 3 times. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and cried. Not the silent, controlled tears she usually allowed herself. Real crying. Ugly crying. The kind that came from somewhere deep and refused to be contained. Mrs. Celeste had remembered her. Had written about her in a journal. Had wished she could have been one of the people who loved her. The connection Verity had sought wasn't delusion. It was real. It had always been real. And now she had to decide. Return to a house where she might be rejected again. Face a man who had looked at her like she was a threat. Risk everything for children who might not forgive her for leaving. Or stay here. Safe. Alone. Slowly disappearing into the darkness that wanted to claim her. I am not fit for love. The words rose up automatically. But this time, they felt different. This time, they felt like a question instead of an answer. Was she not fit for love? Or had she simply been too afraid to find out? Verity thought about her grandmother. About Opal's harsh lessons and desperate pragmatism. About the armor she had been given and the walls she had built. Opal had been wrong. Verity understood that now. Survival wasn't about closing yourself off. It was about finding people worth opening up for. And she had found them. 3 broken children and their broken father. A family that needed her as much as she needed them. The question wasn't whether she was fit for love. The question was whether she was brave enough to try. Verity stood up. She wiped her face. She looked at the suitcase that was still packed, sitting in the corner where she had dropped it 2 weeks ago. Then she picked up the phone and called the number Mrs. Pemberton had included in the letter. "I'm ready to come back," she said when the housekeeper answered. "If they'll have me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Thank God," Mrs. Pemberton said. "I'll send Jeffrey immediately." The car arrived 3 hours later. Verity sat in the back seat, watching the familiar landscape unfold, her heart pounding with fear and hope and something else she couldn't quite name. When Thornfield House appeared on the horizon, she felt tears prick her eyes again. Not from sadness this time. From recognition. This was home. It had become home without her permission, without her planning, without her consent. And she was coming back to fight for it. Jeffrey parked in front of the entrance. Verity climbed out, her legs unsteady, her courage fragile but present. The front door was closed. She had expected Mrs. Pemberton to meet her, but the entrance was empty. She climbed the steps and reached for the door handle. It opened before she could touch it. Thaddeus Whitmore stood in the doorway. He looked terrible. Exhausted. Gaunt. Like he had aged 10 years in 2 weeks. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his eyes red-rimmed from what might have been crying or might have been sleeplessness. They stared at each other across the threshold. "You came back," Thaddeus said. His voice was rough, uncertain. "Mrs. Pemberton sent a letter." "I know. I asked her to." Verity blinked. "You asked her to?" Thaddeus stepped back, making room for her to enter. She didn't move. "I was afraid," he said. "When Cressida showed me that photograph, when I understood that you had a connection to Celeste that you hadn't told me about, I reacted from fear. I thought you had deceived me. I thought everything we had built was based on lies. I should have told you." "Yes. You should have." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "But I should have let you explain. I should have asked questions instead of making accusations. I should have remembered that people are complicated, that they carry histories and connections that aren't always easy to articulate." Verity stood frozen on the threshold, unable to move forward, unable to retreat. "Why did you come?" Thaddeus asked. "The first time, I mean. Why did you take this job?" She had been asked this question before. She had deflected, evaded, given partial answers. Now she gave the truth. "When I was 8 years old, I met a woman at a charity gala. I was the daughter of the cleaning staff, invisible, forgotten, dressed in clothes that didn't fit. I was sitting alone in a corner when she approached me. She took me to a garden and showed me every flower, naming them, telling their stories. She told me I was worthy of kindness. Worthy of love. She made me believe, for 1 hour, that I mattered." Verity's voice cracked, but she continued. "I never forgot her. I never forgot that hour. It sustained me through years of foster care, years of loneliness, years of believing that I wasn't fit for anything good. And when I saw the address for this placement, when I realized whose house this was, I couldn't stay away. I needed to be close to something that reminded me that kindness existed. I needed to honor the memory of the woman who had given me hope when no one else bothered." Thaddeus was very still. "That's why you came?" "Yes." "And why did you stay?" Verity looked at him. Really looked at him. Saw the grief and the fear and the desperate hope underneath. "Because I fell in love with your children. Because they needed someone who understood what it meant to be abandoned. Because Cressida reminded me of myself at her age, all armor and fury. Because Bram's questions made me feel like my answers mattered. Because Rosalind trusted me with her silence when she couldn't trust anyone else with her words." She took a breath. And because you looked at me one night in a dark kitchen and saw someone worth talking to. Someone worth knowing. Someone worth asking questions about. No one had ever looked at me like that. Like I might be more than just useful. Like I might be interesting. Like I might be enough. Thaddeus crossed the threshold and stood in front of her. Close enough to touch, though neither of them reached out. I'm sorry, he said. For sending you away. For not letting you explain. For being so wrapped up in my own fear that I couldn't see you clearly. I'm sorry too. For not being honest from the beginning. For letting my fear of rejection prevent me from trusting you with the truth. They stood in silence for a long moment. The air between them was heavy with everything that had been said and everything that remained unspoken. Finally, Thaddeus spoke again. Will you come back? Not just for the children. For all of us. We need you, Verity. I need you. It was the first time he had used her first name. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to believe I'm worth all this. Then let me believe it for you. Until you can believe it yourself. He extended his hand. Not demanding. Just offering. Verity looked at his hand. Looked at the house behind him, where 3 children were waiting for her return. Looked at the future that had seemed impossible 2 weeks ago and now seemed terrifyingly, wonderfully possible. She took his hand. And stepped across the threshold. The reunion with the children happened in the library. All 3 of them were waiting, arranged on the furniture like they had been posed for a photograph. Cressida sat in one armchair, her face pale and drawn. Bram perched on the edge of a sofa, vibrating with barely contained emotion. Rosalind stood by the window, her small body silhouetted against the light. When Verity entered, followed by Thaddeus, no one moved. Then Bram broke the silence. You came back. His voice was thick with tears. You actually came back. I promised I would stay, Verity said. I'm sorry I broke that promise. I'm sorry I left. It wasn't your fault. Cressida's voice was barely audible. It was mine. I showed Dad the photograph. I told him you were lying. I ruined everything. You didn't ruin anything, Cressida. You reacted to information you didn't understand. That's human. That's normal. But I drove you away. After everything you did for me. After the garden and the conversations and the crying and all of it, I drove you away. Cressida's face crumpled. The composed, sharp-tongued girl was gone, replaced by a child who had lost too much and was terrified of losing more. Verity crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair. Listen to me, she said firmly. You are not responsible for the choices adults make. Your father sent me away because he was afraid, not because of anything you did. And I left because I was ashamed of what I had hidden, not because you exposed it. Neither of those things is your fault. But. No buts. You are 13 years old. You have lost your mother. You have been struggling with grief that no one should have to carry alone. You made a mistake born from confusion and pain. That does not make you a bad person. That makes you human. Cressida stared at her with wet eyes. Then she launched herself forward, wrapping her arms around Verity's neck, sobbing into her shoulder. I'm sorry, she gasped. I'm so sorry. Please don't leave again. Please don't ever leave. I'm not going anywhere, Verity said, holding her tightly. I promise. And this time, I'm going to keep that promise. Bram was next. He tumbled off the sofa and joined the embrace, his small arms wrapping around both of them. I missed you, he said. I had nightmares every night. Bad ones. And I kept waiting for you to come back, but you didn't come back, and I thought maybe you hated us now. I could never hate you, Verity said into his hair. Never. Not possible. They stayed like that for a long moment, the three of them tangled together, tears and apologies and relief mixing in equal measure. Then Verity heard small footsteps crossing the floor. She looked up. Rosalind stood before them. Her face was solemn, her eyes unreadable. In her hand, she held a piece of paper. She extended it toward Verity. Verity took it with trembling fingers. It was a drawing. 5 figures standing in a row, connected by red lines that wove between them like ribbons. One tall figure with dark hair stood at the edge, apart but connected. Beneath the figures, in the same careful, shaky handwriting as before, was a single sentence. "You are family now." Verity's vision blurred with tears. She looked at Rosalind, who was watching her with those ancient, serious eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me a place to belong." And then, for the first time in 2 years, Rosalind opened her mouth and spoke. "Stay," she said. Her voice was rusty, unused, barely audible. But it was there. Stay forever. The sound of that single word, that impossible word from a child who had been silent for so long, broke something in all of them. Cressida pulled back, staring at her sister with shock. Bram gasped. Thaddeus made a choked sound that might have been a sob. Verity gathered Rosalind into the embrace with the others. "Forever," she said. "I promise." And this time, everyone believed her. The proposal came 6 months later. Not in a grand gesture. Not in a dramatic moment. Just a Tuesday evening in October, when the leaves were turning gold and the garden that Verity and Cressida had restored was putting on its final show before winter. Thaddeus found her in the kitchen, making tea. The same kitchen where they had first really talked, all those months ago. "Verity." His voice was strange. Nervous. She turned. And found him on one knee. "Oh," she said. Her hands flew to her mouth. "I had a speech prepared," Thaddeus said. "It was quite good. Eloquent. Moving. I practiced it several times." He paused. "I've completely forgotten all of it." Verity laughed through sudden tears. "That's all right. What I remember is this." He looked up at her with eyes that held no more walls, no more barriers, no more fear. "You walked into this house believing you were not fit for love. You told yourself that story for so long that it became your truth. But Verity Crane, you are the most love-worthy person I have ever known. You loved my children when I couldn't reach them. You loved me when I didn't deserve it. You loved this broken family back together." He held up a ring. "Simple. Beautiful. Perfect. I am asking you to let me spend the rest of my life proving that you were wrong about yourself. I am asking you to be my wife. I am asking you to be my children's mother, officially, permanently, forever." Verity looked at the ring. Looked at the man holding it. Thought about everything she had been through to reach this moment. "I am not fit for love," she said. Thaddeus's face fell. "That's what I told myself," she continued. "Every day for 25 years. I believed it so deeply that it shaped every choice I made, every relationship I avoided, every chance I refused to take." She knelt down so they were face to face. "But you and your children taught me something. You taught me that being fit for love isn't about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to try. It's about showing up even when you're terrified. It's about letting people see you, really see you, and trusting that they won't run away." She took his face in her hands. "Yes, Thaddeus Whitmore. I will marry you. I will be your wife. I will be a mother to Cressida and Bram and Rosalind. I will love this family with everything I have for as long as I live." He kissed her. Right there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the smell of brewing tea and the warmth of a house that had finally become a home. The wedding was small. Held in the restored garden, beneath an October sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or shine and ultimately did both. Cressida served as maid of honor, her sharp edges softened but not erased by the past months of healing. Bram was ring-bearer, vibrating with pride and barely contained energy. Rosalind was flower girl, silent again except when it mattered, but smiling in a way she hadn't smiled since before her mother died. Mrs. Pemberton stood in the back, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief and pretending she wasn't crying. The minister spoke words about commitment and love and the joining of lives. Verity heard them distantly, her attention focused on the man standing across from her, the children arranged around them, the garden that Celeste had planted and Cressida had restored blooming all around them. When it was time for vows, Verity spoke simply. "I came to this house looking for a memory. I found a family instead. I came here broken, convinced that I would never deserve the kind of love that other people took for granted. You showed me I was wrong. All of you. You loved me when I couldn't love myself. You believed in me when I had given up on believing. You gave me a place to belong when I had spent my entire life convinced that no such place existed." She looked at each of the children in turn. At Thaddeus, whose eyes were bright with tears he wasn't hiding. "I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of what you've given me. Not because I have to earn it. But because you've taught me that love isn't about earning. It's about giving. It's about showing up. It's about choosing each other, over and over, through the hard parts and the easy parts and everything in between." She smiled through her own tears. "I choose you. All of you." The reception
Forever.
was held in the house, every room opened and filled with light, as if the estate itself was celebrating. There was dancing and laughter and Bram's endless questions and Cressida's sharp observations and Rosalind's quiet presence, taking everything in with those ancient, knowing eyes. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had left and the children had been put to bed, Verity stood in the library with Thaddeus, looking out at the garden bathed in moonlight. "What are you thinking?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I'm thinking about Celeste," Verity admitted. "I hope she would approve of all of this." "She would." Thaddeus's voice was certain. "She would have loved you. She had a gift for seeing people's hearts, and yours is extraordinary. I barely knew her. 1 hour, 20 years ago. Sometimes 1 hour is enough to change a life." Verity leaned back against him, feeling the warmth of his chest, the steady beat of his heart. "It was enough to change mine," she said. They stood in silence for a long moment, two people who had learned that love wasn't about perfection or worthiness or fitting into some predetermined mold. Love was about choosing. About showing up. About being brave enough to let someone see you clearly and trusting that they would stay anyway. Verity had spent her entire life believing she was not fit for love. And now, standing in her own home, surrounded by her own family, wearing a ring that marked her as belonging, she finally understood the truth. She had always been fit for love. She had simply been waiting for the right people to help her believe it. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in second chances and the power of choosing to love despite fear, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Billionaire Stories with Mr. Lawson for more stories that remind us what matters most. And drop a comment below telling me your favorite moment from Verity's journey. Was it the midnight kitchen conversation? The children's reunion? Rosalind's first word? I want to hear from you. Until next time, remember this. You are worthy of love. Not because you're perfect. Not because you've earned it. But simply because you exist. And anyone who tells you differently, including the voice in your own head, is wrong. Believe it.